Does everybody recognize this? Fred Job had brought this to a meeting, I don't know, a month or 6 weeks or 2 months ago. It's a picture, it's a group picture of the 1946 St. Louis Cardinals. And that year they won the World Series.
Is that the one he was on?
What a joke.
That was pretty nasty. That was pretty nasty, Peggy.
No, don't say anything else, 'cause I've been thinking he's on it, and I want to keep thinking.
Well, he was part of it. I don't think he's in this picture. But
The day the photo.
I became a Cardinal fan. I lived in St. Louis. I was born in St. Louis in 1944, and I think that's the year the Cardinals played the Browns, the St. Louis Browns in the World Series, and they won. And that's, ever since then, I've been a Cardinal fan, big Cardinal fan, really. And anyway, I remember this team, and I remember most of the people, most of the players that were in this picture, because we would listen to them. We had to, of course, they weren't on TV. We didn't have TV then. But we could listen to him on the radio. Harry Carey was the announcer. Of course, I guess Budweiser was their sponsor. Either Budweiser or Falstaff, I don't remember. Anyway, and I remember the game, the World Series game in 1946. They were playing the Red Sox, and we were visiting my uncle in Ohio. It was, I remember, on a Sunday afternoon, we were driving around, and I don't know if it was Game 7, but it was the last game of the series. The Cardinals won it, so that they finished the series. And Enos Country Slaughter, the right fielder, was on first base. Don't remember what the score was or anything, but it must have been tied. But somebody...
3-3.
What was it?
3-3.
3-3. Thank you. You want to do this?
I was, yeah.
Anyway, somebody, who was it, hit the single?
Harry the Hat Walker
Harry the Hat Walker hit a single, and
scored as a double.
Enos Slaughter was always, they called him country. He was a hustler, and he scored all the way from first base on what was supposedly a single. Now you've ruined the story, see? But anyway, it was quite a feat, and I remember that. Cardinals won the World Series, and been a big fan ever since. And without further ado, I'll present this to Fred Job, this picture. It's been, the collection we took up a few weeks ago paid for having the photograph restored and framed. And it's a great job. This is much different than what we saw a few weeks ago. I'll let you present it to him. Do what? You want to come up here, Peggy?
I don't know. I get the reading.
Thank you, President Al. I have some housekeeping, but we'll save that until the end rather than at the start. But if I might help my friend President Al out just a little bit with his story. This is the picture that Fred brought in here 6 or 8 weeks ago, and I volunteered to take it and have it laminated for him. But I could not find anyone that could or would laminate it. So we took it to Sutherland's in Huntsville to see if they could clean it up. And they did a magnificent job, of course, as Al showed you. But if you'll notice here, there's a player with his right arm missing altogether. And here, his arm has been restored. So we're going to give these 2 pictures back to Fred, and as I was thinking of someone that might come and talk baseball with us, last week I happened to be talking to David Kidd, and I said, David, who in Fayetteville could we get to come and present this program for us with these 46 St. Louis Cardinals? And he said, Dick, the person that comes to mind is Ray Fraley. So I called Ray and asked him, gave him a little background information, asked him if he would come and present the program today. And he agreed to do it. Ray was born in Alexandria, Virginia, June 1, 1942. Bachelor's degree from University of North Carolina. Law degree from Cumberland School of Law, Birmingham, Alabama. Married to Debbie Fraley. Children, 4, 1 born in each decade since the 60s. Military service, U.S. Marine Corps, 1966-76. Law practice, 38 years in Lincoln County, Tennessee. Hobbies and interests, triathlon, biking, little theater, reading, Carolina athletics, and baseball. And I can vouch for the biking because just about every day I'll see him out on the old Mulberry Road taking his 10-mile to 15-mile bike ride during lunch.
20.
Let's make Ray welcome, and I know he has an interesting program for us. Ray?
Thank you.
Surely about 20 miles.
Every day. Todos los días. Mark Twain in 1839 claims to have come in on Halley's Comet, and he died in 1910, and he said he went out on Halley's Comet. Fred Jobe was born in 1926 on the wings of the Cardinals. And that year they, of course, won a World Series against the Yankees. My dad always told me he believed in two things: that discipline was the key to life, and that baseball was the greatest game. I suspect that Fred feels that way too. He's been very successful over his lifetime in farming, business, and other things that have made his life fun to live, as they say. But I was thinking about this baseball because you remember we did a little something for Fred some time ago with baseball, Fred. You remember we talked that baseball in St. Louis and so forth? And I got to thinking that every man who is privileged to live as long as you have a little something that you want to leave as a legacy. And I want to change the program a little bit today, and I'm going to feature baseball, but I'm going to feature something that I'm going to help Fred raise $500 for that endowment. I'm going to put it right here, Fred. Now, you're going to have to earn it. Right here. There it is. And we're going to talk a little baseball.
That's 5.
It's not yours yet. These folks out here, your fellow Rotarians, are going to have to help you earn that money. In 1930, do you know what happened in 1930, Fred?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to tell you, because I don't think you'll get this one. Baseball hadn't played with what we call lights, actual lights to light the field in the big leagues. Now I'm talking about. There had been lights as early as before the turn of the century in some colleges and so forth. But the first big league game with lights was in 1930. I want someone to tell me, and each one of these questions, Dick, will you keep score for me on the right answers? Just mark down an answer, and we'll score this. First night game in the big leagues. Anybody tell me?
Philadelphia Connie Mack Stadium.
No, it wasn't. It was the Kansas City Monarchs versus the House of David. 1930. The big leagues were the Negro League. Not major leagues. I said big leagues. Now tell me when the first major league night game was played.
When and where?
Both. That's the wrong answer, Dick, by the way.
My answer was wrong.
Your answer was wrong. It was in Cincinnati. Give me the field. The old field. Crosby Field, that's an answer. You just earned some money. It was in Crosby Field in 1935 that the first night game was actually played in the major leagues. Now, something happened in 1938. He was a left-hander. 1938, first man to ever pitch and the only man to ever pitch back-to-back no-hitters.
Johnny Vandermeer.
Mark it down. But here's the trivia. A lot of folks get that confused and think that's when night baseball was going pretty strong, and they thought maybe he had gotten that night baseball game. He pitched his first game in Crossley, and 4 days later, in June, he threw a no-hitter under the lights, first time ever, at Ebbets Field. Put another one down. That was the trivia. In Brooklyn against the Dodgers. All right. Now, this man was just coming along as baseball was progressing in his time. And in 31, the Cardinals beat the A's. Now, the trivia question is, who was the manager for the A's in 1931? What's his real name? You get half a question on that. Cornelius McGillicuddy. Now, let's talk about him just a minute. One of the great characters in baseball's history. Connie Mack sat in the dugout with a suit and tie, had the high collar. For 50 years, he managed. That's an answer, though. I'm going to give that to him because Connie Mack is exactly right. Now, for my St. Louis man, can you tell me who the manager of the Cards was that year? Gabby Street.
Now, he played ball in Huntsville.
That's what I was coming to. You ought to remember him.
He played in Huntsville.
He went out with Sarah Joe, and you didn't like it. No, I'm just kidding you. He really did.
Gabby Street.
Gabby Street.
He later announced for the Cardinals.
He did. In 1934, the St. Louis Cardinals won another World Series. Do you remember who they played? They played the Tigers. The trivia question is threefold. Who was the manager of the Cardinals in 1934? He was called the Fordham Flash. Does that give you a hint? Frankie Frisch. Fordham University is a Jesuit school in Brooklyn, New York, and if you ever take the train up towards West Point out of New York, you see it sitting up on that little bank, and it's a beautiful, beautiful little Jesuit school. I love it. But they had another famous alumni there who became famous in another sport.
Lou Gehrig.
No, he went to Columbia University. Vince Lombardi. Mark it down. Lou Gehrig, big Jewish family of immigrants, German, went to Columbia University. Never told his mom he signed with the Yankees until it was too late. 1942, the Yanks won another series was won by the Cardinals, and they beat the Yankees that year. And Billy Southworth. That's not a trivia question, but
Billy Southworth.
Billy Southworth. What I really want to ask you, and I made a note to make sure I had this right from your book. You began playing a little baseball with your dad in 1942, I believe, when you played the outfield, and I think you were pretty young then, and your dad pitched.
Without a glove.
Without a glove. Let one go through your legs, and everybody got mad at you, and you said, well, the shortstop missed it. Now, why are you blaming me? Now,
Went in the hole in the fence in outfield.
we share something in common because when I was between 50 and 55 years, my oldest baby boy was a baseball player in college and had a successful career up then. I was proud of him. And after he got out of school one Sunday, he came, said, I want you to go with me. I'm playing in a summer league up in Granny League Park up in Nashville. I said, well, that's a pretty hot league up there. He said, it is. I got in the car with him, and as I got out of the car, he threw me a uniform. I threw 3 innings to my son catching me. Great thrill. And didn't give up any runs, and I was on third base, and he hit a grand slam home run, and I trotted home. 1 week later, I ripped a muscle in my leg pitching in Shelbyville with him. And before I hurt my leg, I called him out. I said, you going to give me some signals today? He said, Pop, I can catch you barehanded. I said, good location. And I gave up 3 dingers that day. Some of those things, you could put a stewardess on them as they left the ballpark. Looked like golf balls going out of there. So I appreciate when my fathers and sons played a little baseball together. In 1943, though, you had something that was really interesting. And this is going to lead to a trivia question for all of us. 1943, Fred went down here to Huntsville, Alabama, at that old park, the Lincoln Mill Park. Merrimack. And struck out 17 hitters.
Lincoln Mill.
Lincoln Mill.
On Meridian Street.
On Meridian. I know the place. He struck out 17 and hit one man inside the head. Now, didn't kill him, but that brings up an interesting trivia question. There have been 2 men who have died as a result of injuries in baseball. One of them, the first, and nobody will know this, I wouldn't think, was Doc Powers, who was a Notre Dame catcher, went into the big leagues, and in 1909, he was a catcher. Going for a foul ball, he ran into the wall and was injured, and they did surgery, and he actually died of complications from surgery, but he's considered the first. But the first actually killed by pitched baseball, and you just said it, mark it down, it's the right answer, was Ray Chapman,
Ray Chapman.
who was born in Kentucky, grew
Ask
up
him
in.
who hit him.
That's the next question. The man who hit him was a sidewinder for the New York Yankees, mean mother. His name was Carl.
Carl Rowe. Carl.
Carl played for the
Mays.
Giants.
Carl Mays.
Carl Mays, write it down. That's the one that not many people get. Carl Mays struck and killed Ray Chapman, who was a delightful human being compared to the pitcher who hit him, who was considered just a acerbic as they come. Fred, you went on to try out that year for the Birmingham Barons. Now, the Birmingham Barons, in those days, you could go and try out and for these teams in the minor leagues, and those great old minor league parks were wooden. And I remember when I played in those old parks in Burlington, North Carolina, you'd hit in batting practice, you'd hit the baseball and you could hear the reverberation around that baseball field as a sound traveled. Amazing things. And you could hear it during the game because there wasn't many folks in the stands. In those days, you could play. I played under the name of Jagady Cloud one time, and Scott McGregor. They give you $50 if you win, and 25 for showing up. In those days, you could make a little extra scratch and maintain your amateur status. You remember those days, Fred, when you would do that?
Lost, you didn't get nothing.
Yeah, if you lost. Now, the point I want to make, when you tried out for the Barons, there was a kid down there also trying out, a left-handed pitcher. You remember who that was? He later pitched for the Cincinnati Redlegs. You know it?
Left-hander.
Left-hander. Who was it?
Ray Nuxall.
Ray? No, not Ray. Joe.
Joe Nuxall. Joe Nuxall.
Half a point. Here's the trivia, though. Joe Nuxall had his distinction. Rob, what was it? Rob, by the way, is the coach, one of the coaches at our new high school, and a baseball man. Joe Nuxall had a distinction that will probably never be equaled again.
Played the youngest player to ever play in the major.
Youngest player to ever play in the majors. That's another half point. What do you think that age was? What do you think his age was? How old are you? 17.
He was
He
younger,
was younger than you.
Younger than that boy.
He took the mound and threw 2/3 of an inning when he was 15 years old. Now, he was almost 16. The closest that I've seen that come to is a kid named David Clyde, who pitched for the Rangers, came out of as a high schooler, and pitched. Now, the interesting thing about Joe Nuxall, and he was a wonderful fellow, by the way, he broadcast for what team for 40 years?
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati. That's a half a point. That was too easy. 40 years he was a broadcaster.
I don't get another dollar.
I want to talk. No, that's not a dollar.
I don't get
That's a
another-
Franklin.
That's all to get another.
When you got a Fraley, you got it. When you got a Franklin, you got a Fraley. That's what I tell my clients. When the money hits the wood, Fred, the case gets good. All right. Now, let's go ahead and talk about a little bit about announcers. One of the things about baseball that's so unique, and I truly believe it's the greatest game, writers that have come down the pike that have been so absolutely brilliant in their writing. You don't get that in football and basketball. You get it in baseball. Ring Lardner, Damon Runyon, who later went on to write Guys and Dolls on Broadway, and those great writers, and Jim Murray with the Los Angeles Times. Do you remember what he said about Willie Mays' glove in the 1954 World Series when he went in the Polo Grounds and made that over-the-head catch of Vic Wertz's drive, and he turned and made the throw? Jim Murray said, Willie Mays' glove is where triples go to die. Unbelievable. We had that shot heard round the world in 1951. Who was it, Fred?
Hank Thompson.
Bobby Thompson.
Bobby Thompson.
Who was pitching? A guy like you. Threw him a big old gopher ball. Ralph Branco. You don't get any points for that. You got to be quicker. He threw that pitch, and Bobby Thompson hit that home run to win the pennant. Calling that game was a fellow named Russ Hodges. And he said, the shot heard round the world. I don't believe what I just saw. You see those things, and Vince Scully. You might have had some favorite announcers, Jack Buck. And by the way, in 46, as you mentioned, Harry Carey, who spent 25 years with the Cardinals. And he didn't get like, well, I'm here now looking at the Cubs, until his last 10 years of his life. Before that, he was a White Sox for about 10 years. 25 years with the Cardinals, 1 year with Oakland. he was quite the character, and of course he had a son and a grandson who became announcers as well. Jack Buck, who was a great announcer and probably hadn't got his due, as Dickie pointed out earlier, has a son that's also announcing. But those writers that came down the pike during those days, there's nobody better than Red Smith, for example, a Notre Dame graduate who wrote the greatest obituaries I've ever read. I've got every obituary in a compilation that he's ever written. They are brilliant writing. And as I learned, it takes quite a stylist to be a decent writer of obituaries. But he did that. And you can go on and on of some of the great writers. As a kid growing up, I loved Bob Addy with the Times Herald, Washington Times Herald. I liked Shirley Povich with the Washington Post, and some of those great writers that came out and came down the pike. Great announcers. We talk about those announcers, and we think about Russ Hodges, we had just mentioned, but the great ones, trivia question, and he'll get this because he was a fellow alumni. Voice of the Yankees for years. Did those great Gillette commercials. Do you remember who he was?
Dizzy D.
No, he did with the Cardinals. And Mel Allen, a Jewish fellow from the University of Alabama with a melodious voice, southern voice. And when I think about those great Jewish populations that were down there, I think about Greenville, Mississippi, where they had this wonderful, wonderful way of making things work with the races and religion in a little place called Greenville, Mississippi, that Eugene's very, very familiar with. Yeah. So we have those great writers and announcers, and Southern, you recall Red Baba in the catbird seat is one of the great, just to listen to him when doing the Dodgers was a thrill. And some of those games that I listened to, with my favorite was Arch McDonald, because he was with the Senators, and you'd hear the games like this. Ticker tape. And then you make it up. All he knew was a strike. He didn't know it was a foul ball otherwise, or he didn't know a fly ball or right. He didn't know what kind of, a long ball, it looks like it might be. No, Sandy Ambrose makes the catch in deep left field. You'd get that kind of ticker tape. My dad and I'd ride around his 1948 Buick with the top down, listen to Arch McDonald's as the Senators took another thumping from the Red Sox, Yankees, and whomever else they played. First in peace, first in war, and last in the American League cellar, Washington Senators, my team. We go on into your life a little bit, Fred, and into the Cardinals. In 1940, Dick or Al mentioned in 1944, and this is some trivia that's really interesting. In 1944, the Cardinals played what team in the World Series? Now think what year this is and what's going on in the world. We're in the midst of a major war. Our players are gone. Go ahead. St. Louis Browns. Now here's the interesting story about the Browns and the Cardinals. They shared the same stadium. Do you know the name of it?
Sportsman's Park.
Sportsman's Park. In 1960, I believe, I may be wrong about my date, but I'm close enough to be pretty certain, a football team moved into that stadium as well. Does anybody know who that was and where they came from?
From Chicago.
From Chicago, the St. Louis, and they called them the Gridbirds so as not to get confused with them. And you remember some of those great players with the Cards, Ollie Matson and some of those wonderful players, but they shared that ballpark. Now, Bill Veeck later became the owner of the Browns, and he wanted to buy it off, but the Browns' main owner went broke and went into bankruptcy, lost the money for some bad investments, and you were wrong about Budweiser and Falstaff. Bush didn't buy that stadium didn't come in Anheuser-Busch until 1968, I think. But in 1953, Bill Veeck said, I've had enough of this Sportsman Park, and he left and went where? With his ball club. In 1954 was the first year there. Baltimore Orioles. He became the Baltimore Orioles, and then we get things like Brooke Robinson and that foursome that won those World Series against the Oakland A's and some of those great years with the Orioles. And that's what was happening in St. Louis in 1944. And then in 46, we have the picture. Now, this 46 picture in the 1946 World Series, won by the Cardinals in 7 on the Mad Dash by Enos Country Slaughter from Roxborough, North Carolina, one of the most proficient hitters, base runners in the history of the game, Hall of Famer.
He was a mean boy, too.
Tough guy from North Carolina, Country Slaughter. Later played for the Yankees and helped them to a World Series. But in this game, when there were two Harrys on that team, one Harry won 3 games as a pitcher. Can you name who that was?
Harry McKean,
But what was his nickname?
the cat.
Harry the Cat Basheen. Left-hander, won 3 games. Now, the man who made the hit that you called a single, but it was scored as a double, by the way. People still think it's a single, but it was scored in the box score as a double. Scoring slider from first base on a great slide. There were 2 other, let me just put it this way. There were three Hall of Famers on that St. Louis team. Can you name them? Dick, you already named one.
Shandy's, Musel, and
Marion, Marty Marion.
No,
Slaughter.
Slaughter,
Shane Deese. And
Shane Dees.
I've got $100 here for this pit kitty if you can spell Shane Deese.
Spell Shane Dees.
CHOENDIENST.
That's so close, but it's not quite there. But I'm going to give you another chance. Try it again. I'm going to give you another chance.
CHOENDIENST.
He just made you $100 for your done. I didn't think anybody would get that one. Thank you, Al. Okay, in that game also, 1946, Fred, 3 of the Cardinals in one game had 4 hits. It's never been done again. In one game, they had one with the Red Sox. A guy named Wally Motus had 4. Can you name the 3 players who got the 4 hits? That's another $100 question, because that's hard.
I imagine that Slaughter was one of them.
Nope, he was not one of them.
Musial.
No. Sam Musial, by the way, was on that ball club and a great one.
It wasn't Joe Garagiola got,
That's one of them.
that's one of them.
Joe Graggiola.
Dick Sisler.
No, Dick didn't have.
Whitey Kurowski.
Whitey Kurowski at third. Good.
I threw batting practice.
And the third one was their shortstop.
Marty Marion.
Second baseman, excuse me.
Second baseman was,
JP.
what was his name?
Look on that picture.
It don't list the
Oh, it
positions.
doesn't look, no.
Johnny Pesky
Johnny Pesky.
had the 4 hits. And that was an interesting game because Wally Moses,
Pesky played with the Red Sox.
Red Sox.
that's what I said.
Johnny Pesky.
Well, he later went when one of the players had 4 hits in that game. Now, let me ask you this, just to make it sort of interesting. In 1946 was the year that Ted Williams came back from the military. He was a United States Marine fighter pilot, and this was his first series back. He was the MVP in 1946, hit 345, 342, ton of RBIs. On that 46 team was Dom Dimaggio. Remember Dom? There were 2 other Dimaggios that played in the big leagues,
Vince and Joe.
Vince and Joe. One of my favorite players of all time, Dizzy Dean, said of Vince Maggio one game, he says, I'm going to strike him out 4 times and bet $100 I can do it. And they took the bet, struck him out 3 times. The 4th time he hit a pop-up. Dizzy, foul ball. Dizzy says, drop it, drop it, drop it. He dropped it, he struck him out. Now, Vince was the least of the talent of those DiMaggio brothers. Of course, the Yankee Clipper Joe was the elite, but the little professor, Dom DiMaggio, was a heck of a player and a 300 hitter and in that World Series. But here's the interesting thing about that series. Ted Williams had a terrible series. He hit 200, 5 for 25. Do you know why he had a bad year, a bad series? What had happened was, back in those days, teams barnstormed and played exhibition games, and before the series started, he was in an exhibition game and got hit on the hand, and he was not gripping well enough to hit. And that was his only World Series appearance for his whole career. The greatest hitter in baseball, in my opinion. One chance, and that was it. That was in 1946. Harry the Hat Walker, Harry the Cat Machine were some of the great names that came out of there. Now, in 1964 was the next time St. Louis got to the World Series, and they beat, do you remember who they beat in 64?
Baltimore.
Nope,
New York Yankees.
that's exactly right.
Yogi
And
Berra was the manager, and Shane Dees was the manager of the Cardinals.
no, Shane Dees, Johnny Keane was,
Keane.
and here's the interesting thing about that. The next year, Johnny Keane won the World Series, and he was let go, and where do you think he went? Don't you say, Dickie, I think I already told you. Where do you think he went? The next year he managed the Yankees. He beats him one year, loses his job, and the next thing you know, he's in New York. Strange. 1967, Red Shandies led the Cardinals over. Do you remember who they beat?
Red Sox, Baltimore.
They beat the Red Sox. And then in 1968, I remember this game like it was yesterday. 1968, the St. Louis Cardinals lost to the Detroit Tigers. I never forget it because in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, they let us listen to it on Armed Forces Radio. And you remember who was pitching for the Tigers that year? The two mainstays? The Doughboy and a guy named Denny McLean who later went to the federal penitentiary. Can you name the pitcher who won 3 games for the Tigers that year? Big left-hander. Rob?
I know who you're talking about, I can't think of his name. Left-handed, threw kind of sidearm like that.
His name was Mickey Lolich.
Mickey Lovich.
Sorry, I'm sorry, nobody. Come on, Rob, I brought you here to earn some money. All right. 1982, the White Sox won one. The Cardinals won one with against the Brewers. But do you remember who the manager was that year? They called him the White Rat. Whitey Herzog, who originally signed with. That's where I knew him in 1950s when I watched him play. He signed with the Senators. Whitey Herzog became a manager that of some repute and won that series with against the Brewers. 1980, and then they didn't win again until 2006. And when they beat, do you remember who they beat then with La Russa? They beat the Tigers. And then Fred, you said something on TV that was pretty interesting. Fred's been sick, we all know that, and he's been sick for a long time. And this endowment's important to him, it's important to this community, and I'm glad I hope somebody can help you win this last two.
He ain't gonna leave here.
All right. But he made the comment, I've been off chemo now for a year, and they said I'd be dead in 6 months. Now, I told you, Mark Twain came in on Haley's Comet and left on Haley's Comet. I thought maybe you go out with the victory that the Rangers lost to the Cardinals this year, but damn, you survived again. That's your Cardinals, and if the Cardinals win this year, next year, you'll be alive to 110. So that's what we're hoping. And this one, I'm just throwing that in for nothing. Thanks, Fred, for wonderful stuff you do for us.
Thank you, Ray.
Appreciate it.
Hey, Ray, don't feel sorry for him. We're having, in order to talk about the Valentine dance. Guess how many women he's carrying with him?
He's a Lothario, there's no question about that.
Look at him. No, he's got 3. He had 3 there. Now
Thanks for
he's got
having me.
one. He's only carrying 2.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.